The thermometer outside Jack Thomas's cabin window read 40 degrees below zero. And the temperature was still falling. In the 5 years he had lived in this remote corner of Montana, he had never seen the temperature drop so low. The approaching storm wasn't just another winter challenge. It was a force of nature so intense that even the most experienced wilderness dwellers would hesitate to face it. Deep in the heart of Montana's wilderness, where the nearest town was a 4-hour drive away, Jack's cabin stood alone against the vast, unforgiving landscape. The wooden structure, worn and weathered by countless storms, had been his refuge since he left behind a fast-paced life as a wildlife photographer in Chicago. Tonight, the howling winds and bitter cold would push his decision to live in isolation to its breaking point. The morning had begun like any other. Jack woke to the familiar sound of crackling wood in his fireplace. The warmth from the fading embers barely reached the far corners of his modest living room. And the frost on his windows was thick, a reminder of how cold the world had become outside. Through the glass, he could see fresh snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the ground in a thick layer of white. It wasn't unusual for snow to accumulate in Montana during the winter months. But today it seemed different, heavier, as if nature was preparing for something bigger. At 45 years old, Jack had developed a careful routine to survive in these extreme conditions. Every morning began with a check of his weather radio, followed by an assessment of his supplies and a review of his essential equipment. His cabin, though simple, was well stocked with preserved food, medical supplies, and emergency gear. Jack had learned over the years that in the wilderness, the unexpected could happen at any moment. He couldn't afford to be unprepared. The walls of his cabin were lined with photographs of wildlife he had captured during his years as a photographer, images of wolves, elk, and bears in their natural habitat. They served as silent companions in his solitude. They reminded him of the beauty of the world outside his cabin, but also of the dangers that came with living so close to nature. That morning, however, the weather report was particularly concerning. A massive storm system was moving in from the north, promising record low temperatures and winds strong enough to snap trees. Jack had seen this type of storm before, and he knew it would be a dangerous one. The kind of weather that could trap someone inside their cabin for days, maybe even weeks. He spent the morning securing his generator and checking his backup heating system, ensuring that both would work in case of a power failure. The routine had become second nature to him over the years, but he never allowed himself to become careless. In the wilderness, one small mistake could be fatal. His father's old words echoed in his mind: "Nature doesn't forgive carelessness." Son, those words had kept him alive more times than he could count. By early afternoon, the storm had begun to make its presence known. Snow fell in thick curtains, reducing visibility to mere feet beyond his porch. The wind had picked up, and it was howling through the trees, creating a constant eerie whistle that seemed to pierce through the walls of his cabin. Jack added more logs to the fireplace and moved a few large containers inside to fill with water, knowing that his pipes might freeze despite the heat tape he had carefully wrapped around them. The storm intensified as evening approached, and Jack knew the worst was yet to come. As night fell, he prepared a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, conserving his fresh supplies for what might turn into a long stretch of being stuck inside. But what came next would challenge everything he knew about survival in the wilderness. Just after midnight, through the howling wind, Jack heard a sound that made him sit up straight in his chair. It was a deep, guttural growl, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years in the wild. A bear, and it was close. In Montana, bears should be hibernating deep in their dens by February. The fact that one was active during these conditions meant something was terribly wrong. Jack grabbed his flashlight and approached his window cautiously, cutting through the swirling snow with the beam. The temperature now read 45 below zero, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. Through the storm, he could make out 3 dark shapes moving through the snow: a mother bear and her 2 cubs. Their movements were slow and labored, even from the safety of his cabin. Jack knew something was terribly wrong. The mother bear, usually so powerful, was struggling to move. Her usual graceful stride had become a painful shuffle. And the cubs, who should have been nestled close to her for warmth, were barely moving, their small bodies shaking violently against the cold. The situation was dire. and Jack felt a surge of worry that he had never experienced in all his years of wilderness survival. The bears were struggling to survive, and Jack knew he had to make a choice. Jack Thomas stood at the window, staring out at the three dark shapes moving slowly through the blizzard. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the mother bear struggle against the wind, her massive body swaying as she fought to keep her cubs close. The cold was unbearable, and it was clear to Jack that the bears wouldn't survive much longer in these conditions. The cubs were too small, too weak, and the mother bear, despite her size, was already showing signs of hypothermia. Every instinct in Jack screamed at him to stay inside, to wait out the storm and let nature take its course. The wilderness was a harsh and unforgiving place, and he had spent his entire life learning the rules of survival. One of those rules was to avoid direct interaction with wild animals, especially bears. The mother bear, even in her weakened state, could still be dangerous if she felt threatened. Jack knew that if he opened the door, he was taking a risk not only with his own life but also with the lives of the bears. But as he looked out at the freezing family, his resolve began to weaken. The cold had already begun to take its toll. The mother bear's fur was crusted with ice, her movements slow and erratic. One of the cubs had collapsed into the snow, and the other was struggling to stand. Jack could hear their weak growls, barely audible over the wind, and it broke his heart. He had photographed countless bears in his career, documenting their strength, their grace, their power, but what he saw now was different. This wasn't the majestic creature he had spent years studying. This was a mother fighting for her cubs, battling against an environment that was too cold and too brutal for even her to endure. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on him. The wilderness had taught him to be self-reliant, to trust his instincts and his training. But this wasn't just about survival. It was about something deeper, a connection between humans and animals that went beyond the rules of nature. He had always believed that nature should take its course, that human intervention was often more harmful than helpful. But as he watched the bears, he couldn't help but wonder if sometimes survival meant more than just following the rules. Jack's father's voice echoed in his mind. Nature doesn't forgive carelessness. Son, he had heard those words countless times growing up, and they had guided him through the most difficult moments of his life. But as he stood there, watching the bears slowly freeze to death, he realized that perhaps it wasn't carelessness to help. Perhaps it was the right thing to do. His mind raced as he weighed the risks. The bears were in a critical condition, and the storm was only getting worse. If he didn't act soon, they would die. But if he did act, he was stepping into dangerous territory. There was no guarantee that the mother bear wouldn't attack. She might see him as a threat to her cubs, and in her desperate state, she could strike without hesitation. The situation was unpredictable, and the stakes were higher than ever. Jack glanced at his emergency radio. The storm was expected to last another 12 hours, and the conditions would only continue to worsen. If he didn't do something, the bears wouldn't make it through the night. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his decision. He knew what he had to do. Slowly, he moved away from the window and approached the door. His hands shook as he reached for the handle, his breath fogging up the glass. He glanced back at the bears one last time. The mother bear's eyes met his, and in that moment, he saw something in them, a kind of understanding, a silent plea. With a deep breath, Jack opened the door. The cold air rushed in, stinging his skin, but Jack barely noticed. The only thing that mattered now was getting the bears to safety. He stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching in the snow, and he moved slowly toward the struggling family. The wind howled around him, but Jack remained focused. He could feel the intense heat of the situation, the pressure building as he inched closer to the mother bear. He knew that if she attacked, it would be too late to react. Every move had to be calculated, every action deliberate. As he approached, the mother bear lifted her head. Her eyes were filled with exhaustion, but there was no aggression in them. Jack whispered softly to her, trying to calm her, trying to show her that he meant no harm. Her nostrils flared as she sniffed the air, and for a moment, Jack thought she might lash out. But instead, she remained still, watching him with what seemed like a mix of wariness and resignation. He reached into the bag slung over his shoulder and pulled out a thick wool blanket. He moved slowly, draping it over one of the cubs, and then the other. The mother bear made no move to stop him. She watched intently, as if understanding that he was trying to help. With a deep breath, Jack moved even closer, guiding the cubs toward the door of his cabin. The wind was picking up again, but he pressed on, feeling the urgency of the moment. The cubs, still weak and shivering, were not moving much, but they followed his movements as he gently prodded them toward warmth. Finally, with great care, Jack coaxed the family of bears into the cabin, closing the door behind them. The warmth from the fire began to seep into their frozen bodies, and the relief was immediate. Jack stood there for a moment, watching the bears huddled together in the warmth. He had done the right thing. The rules of survival had been bent, but in the end, it was the right choice. The wind howled outside Jack Thomas's cabin, but inside, a different kind of battle was taking place. The warmth of the fire crackled in the hearth, but it wasn't enough to completely erase the cold that had settled in the bones of the bears. Jack sat near the fire, his gaze never leaving the family of bears huddled together in the corner of his cabin. The mother bear's once mighty form now slumped, exhausted, her breathing shallow. The cubs were no better, their small bodies barely moving under the thick wool blankets Jack had draped over them. The cabin, which had always been a place of refuge, now felt like a temporary shelter for this struggling family. Jack knew that as much as he wanted to help them, their survival was far from guaranteed. The cold had already taken its toll on them, and it was hard to tell if they would fully recover. The fire burned low as Jack silently observed the bears. Shadow and Storm, the dogs he had raised over the years, were still at the door, their instincts alert, but they didn't show any signs of aggression toward the bears. Jack had trained them to remain calm in the presence of wild animals. And now, the two dogs lay quietly, watching the bears with a mix of curiosity and concern. As the night wore on, the mother bear stirred for the first time since entering the cabin. She lifted her head slightly and turned to look at Jack, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite describe. It wasn't aggression, nor was it fear. It was something more primal, a silent plea for help. Jack's heart softened, and he knew that the decision to open that door had been the right one. But it wasn't over yet. The bears still needed to be strong enough to survive. Jack carefully approached the family, moving slowly so as not to startle them. He had learned over the years how to read animal behavior. But this was different. These were not the wild, untamable creatures he had photographed in the past. These were animals in distress, in need of help. As he neared the mother bear, she didn't move, but her eyes followed him, tracking his every movement. Jack took a deep breath, reaching out to touch her fur gently. It was cold to the touch, and he could feel the ice forming in her thick coat. He knew he had to act quickly if they were to survive. He reached for the first aid kit he had kept in his cabin, prepared for any emergency. The storm outside was still raging, and the idea of moving the bears back into the snow seemed impossible. The safest course of action was to keep them inside, at least until the storm passed. But Jack knew he couldn't keep them in his cabin forever. Over the next several hours, Jack worked tirelessly to care for the bears. He checked their temperature, making sure they were warm enough to recover, and he made sure they had enough water to drink. The cubs, though still weak, were beginning to stir more frequently, their tiny bodies moving slightly under the blankets. The mother bear's breathing had steadied, and for the first time in hours, Jack saw a glimmer of hope. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, there was a fragile sense of peace. Jack knew that the bears were no longer on the edge of death. They had survived the night, and that was a victory in itself. But there was still work to be done. He had to keep them safe until they were strong enough to survive on their own again. As dawn broke over Montana, the storm slowly began to subside. The snow continued to fall, but the winds had died down, and the temperature started to rise slightly. Jack sat by the window, watching the family of bears as they rested in the warmth of his cabin. The fire was now a soft glow, and the cubs were no longer shivering. The mother bear's body was still weak, but her eyes had lost the desperation they had held just hours before. She was starting to trust him. For Jack, the next few days would be a delicate balance. He couldn't keep the bears in his cabin forever, and he knew that once they were strong enough, he would have to release them back into the wild. But in that moment, as he watched them, he knew that he had made the right choice. Sometimes, survival wasn't just about following the rules. It was about knowing when to bend them for the sake of something greater. As the days passed, the bears continued to recover. Jack kept a close watch on them, offering food and water when needed. But for the most part, he let them rest. The cubs were more active now, their small paws testing the ground beneath them. The mother bear was still weak, but she had regained some strength. Her body, though battered by the cold, was slowly returning to its usual size and strength. The bond between Jack and the bears grew stronger with each passing day. He could feel their trust in him growing, and he knew that they were starting to understand that he wasn't a threat. He had opened the door not out of naivety, but out of necessity, and he had done so with the understanding that life in the wild was fragile. Eventually, the storm cleared completely, and the sun broke through the clouds. The world outside was transformed into a pristine landscape of snow and ice. Jack stood at the window, looking out at the world beyond. The bears, now fully recovered, were ready to return to the wild. The time had come to say goodbye. The days had passed, and the storm outside had finally subsided, leaving Jack Thomas with the bittersweet task of deciding when to release the bears back into the wild. The harsh winter had claimed much from them, but in the safety of his cabin, the family of bears had slowly regained their strength. The cubs were now playful, their small bodies no longer trembling under the wool blankets Jack had provided. The mother bear, though still not fully restored, was stronger than she had been when she first arrived. Every morning, Jack checked on them, making sure they were comfortable and well fed. But he knew this time of shelter could not last forever. There was a delicate balance he had to maintain. He couldn't let them grow too accustomed to human presence. They were wild animals, and they belonged in the Montana wilderness, not in the warmth of his cabin. The night before, Jack had sat by the fire, thinking about everything he had witnessed, the fierce storm, the desperation in the mother bear's eyes, and the bond that had slowly developed between him and these creatures. There had been no aggression in the mother bear's gaze when she first locked eyes with him. Only a deep, instinctual understanding that she had no other choice but to trust him. But Jack knew that releasing them back into the wild was not without risk. The storm might have passed, but the harsh winter conditions were still present. The forest was unforgiving, and there was no guarantee that the family of bears would survive once they were out of the shelter of his cabin. Jack had taken a chance by opening his door to them, but now, the choice to let them go was just as difficult. The next morning, the sun rose in a brilliant display of light over the snowy expanse of Montana. The sky was clear, and the storm had left a world of pristine snow in its wake. The temperature had risen slightly, though still below freezing, and the air was crisp with the promise of another cold night. Jack stood by his window, looking out at the forest. He knew it was time. The bears had healed, and the instinctual pull of the wild was growing stronger in the mother bear. She was restless, pacing around the cabin as if she could feel the call of the forest, urging her to return. Jack gathered a few supplies for their journey, extra blankets, some food, and a few bottles of water, and made his way to the storage room where the bears had spent their last few days. The mother bear was standing near the door, her eyes focused on him as if she knew what was coming. She had been waiting for this moment, and so had Jack. He carefully opened the door, letting the cool air from outside rush in. The mother bear lifted her head, her nostrils flaring as she sniffed the fresh air. Her cubs followed her, eager to leave the cabin and explore the world once more. Jack could see the determination in her movements, a stark contrast to the exhaustion she had shown just days before. She had regained her strength, and it was time for her to reclaim her place in the wild. Jack stepped back, giving the bears space to move. The cubs hesitated for a moment, their small bodies not yet fully adjusted to the cold. But the mother bear nudged them forward, urging them out the door. Jack watched silently, knowing that this was the moment of truth. He had opened his door to them once, but now he had to let them go, trusting that they would be able to survive on their own. The mother bear paused at the threshold, looking back at Jack. There was no aggression in her gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement. She had trusted him, and now it was time for her to move on. Jack held her gaze, feeling a deep connection to the creature that had once been a symbol of untamable wildness. In that moment, he understood the delicate balance between humans and nature, how one could intervene to protect, but never to control. With a final glance, the mother bear turned and led her cubs into the snow. Jack followed them with his eyes as they made their way toward the forest. The cubs bounded through the snow, their small bodies full of energy as they explored their surroundings. The mother bear moved more slowly, her powerful form silhouetted against the rising sun. They disappeared into the trees, leaving behind only their tracks in the snow. Jack stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the family of bears as they made their way into the wilderness. He felt a sense of peace wash over him, knowing that he had done the right thing. He had bent the rules of survival to save their lives. But in doing so, he had learned something profound about the connection between humans and wildlife. Sometimes, survival wasn't just about following the rules. It was about knowing when to step outside of them and make a choice that mattered. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Jack closed the door and turned back to his cabin. The storm was over, but the lessons of the past few days would stay with him forever. He would always remember the look in the mother bear's eyes, and the bond they had shared during those long, cold days. And as he returned to his life in the wilderness, he knew that the wild would continue to teach him, as long as he remained open to its lessons.